At the end of the Second World War, a number of trials were held, bringing many Nazi war criminals to justice inside of a courtroom. Many were sentenced to death and were executed, and amongst them were a number of women who were known for their brutality, evil, and executions that they carried out inside the concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen was a site of depravity when the Allied liberators entered the camp, and they came across a camp where over 10,000 corpses were lying unburied. The task following the clean-up operation then shifted to bringing the guards who committed these evils to justice, and it was found that many had worked at other sites such as Auschwitz. But amongst the guards were 3 women who were sentenced to death and were executed inside of Hamelin Prison by the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint. But following their executions, they were initially interred in a hastily dug grave, but then these women were disinterred and were dug up. Join us today as we look at the exhumation of the female guards of Bergen-Belsen, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. When the liberators entered Bergen-Belsen, they found a camp which was overcrowded and there was much suffering. Many people had succumbed to diseases and conditions at the site, and a reporter summed up the feeling. He said, "Here over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful, ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do, with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. Babies had been born here, tiny whitened things that could not live. A mother driven mad screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child, and thrust a tiny mite into his arms, then ran off, crying terribly. He opened the bundle and found the baby had been dead for days. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life." There was a huge amount of horror, and the British did not initially have the amount of manpower to clean up the camp, and they then forced the SS guards who had worked there to bury the bodies, and many of these brought to do this were women who had been placed under arrest. Many of the former SS guards who survived the typhus epidemic and remained in charge at Belsen were then taken to the Belsen trials. There were at least 480 people who had worked there, but there were only 45 brought to trial, including former Commandant Josef Kramer and 16 female SS guards. Amongst these women were 3 women who were condemned for their involvement in the concentration camp system, and these were the notorious Irma Grese, the powerful Elisabeth Volkenrath, and the sadistic Juana Bormann. Juana Bormann was a woman who had joined the SS to begin with to earn more money in cash, and she was sent to work inside of Auschwitz, and whilst there she became known as the Weasel, or the woman with the dogs. She would patrol the selection yards, picking women and children to be sent to their deaths in the gas chambers, and whilst patrolling the camp, she would encourage her big dog to attack, maul and even kill the prisoners. She was known for being sadistic, with her big wolfhound attacking helpless prisoners. She was said to have murdered a number of inmates in this way, but she was involved in the murderous selections, and she got stuck into the deadly day-to-day running of the camp. Bormann travelled to Belsen and remained there to allegedly keep order, but she continued her brutality and beatings before she was then arrested and was placed on trial. The courtroom heard of her evil and murder that she committed at Belsen and also at Auschwitz, and for this she was sentenced to death. Juana Bormann was hanged by British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, and he later said of her execution that she limped down the corridor looking old and haggard. She was 42, actual age 52, standing only a little over 5 feet. She was trembling as she was put on the scale. In German she said, "I have my feelings." She was executed on the gallows, but she was one of 3 female guards of Belsen who were condemned. What saved a number of women from their date with the gallows was the fact those who were executed had all worked at Auschwitz and had all been involved in the selections. One woman who became notorious for her running of Auschwitz was Elisabeth Volkenrath. She was just a young woman in her 20s when she was executed, but she became one of the most powerful women in the whole of the concentration camp system. She began life in the SS working at Ravensbrück as a guard, but she was then picked out and mentored by Maria Mandel, and she was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Whilst here she took part in selections, and she worked then as an Oberaufseherin, meaning that she was one of the most senior female guards of Auschwitz, and had power over all women prisoners and female guards. She would carry out executions and was known for beating inmates, but then she also was sent to Bergen-Belsen when Auschwitz closed. She continued to be the superior female guard at Belsen, but then following arrest she was sentenced to death and was executed at Hamelin Prison, and was just 26 when she was executed for her evil. But one woman who encountered the gallows at a younger age was Irma Grese, who was known as a beautiful beast. Grese has become one of the most notorious women who worked inside of the concentration camps, and she was an ardent Nazi who began her career at Ravensbrück. She was then transferred to Auschwitz, and whilst here, she was known for her evil. She would force inmates to work incredibly hard, and would shoot inmates when she wanted, and would brutalise and beat women on a daily basis. If someone dared to look at her, she would take their life, and she would patrol also with a large dog that was trained to kill. She was known for her poor treatment of inmates, and was also sentenced to death for her crimes. Albert Pierrepoint wrote of her execution, "We climbed the stairs to the cells, where the condemned were waiting. A German officer at the door leading to the corridor flung open the door, and we filed past a row of faces and into the execution chamber. The officers stood at attention. Brigadier Patton Walsh stood, with his wristwatch raised. He gave me the signal, and a sigh of released breath was audible in the chamber. I walked into the corridor. Irma Grese, I called. The German guards quickly closed all grills on 12 of the inspection holes and opened one door. Irma Grese stepped out. The cell was far too small for me to go inside, and I had to pinion her in the corridor. Follow me, I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. At 9:34 a.m, she walked into the execution chamber, gazed for a moment at the officials standing round it, then walked on to the centre of the trap, where I had made a chalk mark. She stood on this mark very firmly, and as I placed the white cap over her head, she said in her languid voice, "Schnell." The drop crashed down, and the doctor followed me into the pit and pronounced her dead. After 20 minutes, the body was taken down and was placed into a coffin ready for burial. Following the executions of the guards of Bergen-Belsen, the stories of these men and women were not over. The women's coffins were taken out of the execution chamber, with their bodies inside, and were then buried next to the other SS guards, in the prison yard of Hamelin Prison. These graves were dug very quickly, close by to the execution chamber. But at the same time the prison was under British control, but then when Hamelin was scheduled to be closed, the prisoners were sent to a different prison. But the graves of the female guards and the former Belsen guards were then dug up and disinterred, and this included the coffin of Volkenrath, Grese and Bormann. These graves were mass graves, and in 1950 the British handed Hamelin back to the Germans. There was a lot of tension about pro-Nazi groups in Germany at the time, and some of these wanted the women to be given a proper Nazi burial and a send-off, but in March 1954 the graves were exhumed and the ground was broke to dig them up. The remains were exhumed, and specialists identified the remains of the women, and their bones were then placed inside separate coffins, and they were prepared for reburial in a different plot. In total 91 bodies were exhumed, and they were then buried in Hamelin's Am Wehl Cemetery. This cemetery held the remains of World War I soldiers, but to begin with it said there would be no memorials allowed for the graves of the exhumed former guards, but only wooden crosses which could mark them if the families paid for it. The 3 female executed guards of Bergen-Belsen, Grese, Volkenrath and Bormann, were buried there following their exhumations. One newspaper article stated that British occupation authorities refused to interfere with German authorities who moved the bodies from a mass grave to individual plots in the city cemetery, after a campaign by neo-Nazi elements in Hamelin, Lower Saxony. 30 of the 90 bodies of the executed war criminals had already been moved from a common grave near Hamelin and reinterred in the city's cemetery. The remaining bodies will be moved later. Amongst those reburied are Josef Kramer, named the Beast of Belsen, by the inmates of the notorious death camp, and Irma Grese, who hounded women at Belsen. The decision to rebury these women and the other Nazi war criminals attracted some criticism, but these women had been imprisoned at Hamelin and had been executed there, buried in the prison yard, and then dug up before being buried in a cemetery nearby. As years went on, many neo-Nazis would visit this gravesite and would hold rallies there, and wooden crosses were placed on the site, and the graveyard became a site for tourists to visit. But then the crosses were removed, and the gravesite became just a plain grass field, but today the female executed guards are still buried there today near to a path. The female guards of Bergen-Belsen who were executed were known for their brutality and evil, and they became infamous for their murderous antics inside of Auschwitz and Belsen. There was a great amount of criticism with their exhumation, as many ex-Nazi war criminals, including Rudolf Hess, had been cremated in the years after the war, and their ashes were then scattered. But still today, Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath and Juana Bormann are buried in that graveyard, a short distance from where they were executed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.